like,
All right. Is my screen already shared?
no, it's not.
Oh,
It's like,
can you enable my screen sharing? Dun-dun-dun. All right. You should see the first slide now. Yeah. Okay. All right. Lecture 14. Um, Steiner continues to circle around and deepen into some themes we've been discussing for several weeks now. I wanted to start with this anecdote that Elizabeth Anscombe, one of Ludwig Wittgenstein's students, related in some biographical writing she did about Wittgenstein, who was her professor, one of, I think, the only woman he allowed to study with him. And he once asked her, "Tell me, why do people always say that it was natural for men to assume that the sun went around the earth rather than the earth was rotating?" And Anscombe answered, "Well, obviously, because it just looks as if the sun is going around the earth." To which Wittgenstein replied, "Well, what would it look like if it had looked as if the earth were rotating?" I think this somewhat elliptical story, this exchange between Wittgenstein and Anscombe, it shows the subtle ways that thought participates in fact, right? The way that phenomena and theory relate. And Steiner wants to draw our attention to what we actually observe, right? And I thought I'm going to bring some Whitehead in today, Whitehead's understanding of perception. And Whitehead begins Process and Reality by reminding us that the history of thought shows that false interpretations of observed facts enter into the records of their observation. Thus, both theory and received notions as to facts are in doubt. So Steiner begins this chapter by, reminding us to really attend closely to what we observe, right? He says the Ptolemaic and the Copernican systems are both attempts to synthesize the phenomena that are observed, to comprehend within certain math-like figures what has been perceived. And he adds parenthetically, I say perceived because it would not be enough to say seen, where, perception here, I think he means to distinguish it from seeing, as perception having some mixed up, some mixture with concepts and with thoughts, right? And we might not realize we've already mixed our perceptions with our thinking. We might think we're just seeing what's there. He continues, for it is precisely observation upon which all our geometry, all of our calculating and measuring must ultimately be founded. At bottom, the only question is whether we are comprehending the observed facts correctly. And then he adds that the sciences, modern science, materialistic science, as currently practiced, takes perception at face value. And I'll return to that. And Steiner then talks about this example of the horse, the cartoon drawing of the horse, where the motion of a galloping horse is a mere appearance when really we're just looking at still frames. And he points out that, from the Copernican point of view, when we observe the position of Mars, say, night after night after night, we're getting a kind of snapshot. And in our theorizing about this, we add, with a kind of mathematical line, this motion, but it's a kind of cartoon image of the heavens, he's saying. It's like the night sky is a kind of cartoon flip book. And the problem, Steiner says, is that yes, we want to be scientific, which means we have to attend to the material of observation. But the Copernican approach has been observing only with our physical eyes, and it's been seeking to translate this mere visual perception into a rigid geometrical model. And I'll bring in Whitehead here to help us understand how I think what Steiner is saying is that time and concrete time, duration, as Bergson would say, And therefore, also real motion, living motion, is not measurable. It's not calculable. And I think Whitehead helps us understand this with his account of perception in terms of these two modes. And I've mentioned these earlier. There's perception in the mode of causal efficacy, which he also refers to as non-sensuous perception of bodily feelings, of moving out of the past and into the future. That's our perception of time through causal efficacy. And then there's perception in the mode of presentational immediacy, which is dominated by visual perception through the eyes of space now. And he says the separation of the potential extensive scheme, and when he talks about extension, he means something, a field of topological relationships that would be prior to the division into space and time. So the separation of the potential extensive scheme into past and future lies with the mode of causal efficacy and not with that of presentational immediacy. The mathematical measurements derivable from the latter, derivable from presentational immediacy, are indifferent to the temporal distinction between past and future. Whereas the physical theory, expressed in terms of causal efficacy, is wholly concerned with it, is wholly concerned with this causal efficacy, this passage from past to future. So he's distinguishing here between the mathematical models and the physical theory. When he talks about physical theory, he's saying, well, this is how nature must actually be doing it. That's what we're searching for with a physical theory, whereas mathematical models can only tell us, they grant us measurement of a spatial present, but that's only part of the full picture of perception. It's only part of what we observe, actually. So he then adds, every statement about the geometrical relationships of physical bodies in the world is ultimately referable to certain definite human bodies as origins of reference, right? And so, like Steiner, he's trying to put the human being back into astronomy, and rather than trying to leave us out, as though we could have a view of the cosmic process from nowhere, he adds, a traveler who has lost his way should not ask, where am I? What he really wants to know is, where are the other places? He has got his own body, but he has lost them, right? So as Steiner is telling us, we need to observe not just the heavens as if we were set apart from them, viewing them from outside, but observe the motions of the heavens as connected with the motions of our own bodies, the growth and life of our own bodies. So true observation of and comprehension of heavenly movement requires considering those movements not just via visual sensations formed into these cartoon models, but via the whole gestalt of human development. So real physical theory then would require perception in terms of our whole physiology, using all of the organs at our disposal, the five senses, yes, but also all of our other organs. And some of those organs were still in the process of growing, right? Imagination, inspiration, intuition. So Steiner then, after describing the Copernican model, which uses these visual sensations and these abstract mathematical models, he goes back to the Ptolemaic, the origins of the Ptolemaic astronomical model, helping us remember the original feelings that underlie that model. And he describes the planetary bodies as just visual signs of a sphere, of a larger organism, say, so that we are inside the moon sphere, right? And we are also inside the sun sphere. And so Steiner says that the moon is in reality a nexus of forces that's pervading us all the time, and that what's visible to our eyes is no more than a fragmentary revelation of cosmic space, which in reality is filled with qualitatively differentiated substance. And here I think, by analogy to cytoplasm, right? This qualitatively differentiated substance that fills space and constitutes these various planetary spheres is like cytoplasm. And indeed, he makes this analogy between the moon and a gamete, and that the way that there's a germinative area in the gamete, so that the Earth and the moon Steiner describes as two aspects of a single process, a single organic whole. And we can then come to see what visual sensations give us of this moon in the night sky that appears simply located there as a visible sign, he says, that points us. It's not the moon itself, it's a sign that points us to the fuller reality of this moon organism that we are inside of. Right? So these bodies are not, from this original Ptolemaic geocentric point of view, they're not out there in space, right? We are inside of them. And then, to contrast this with the modern Copernican model, then, again, we're living inside of this toy model of the universe constructed out of visual sensations and measurements and rigid mathematical models. Steiner says, after the feeling of original participation had faded, well, that's my gloss. There shouldn't be a quote there. Steiner's quote is, after this original feeling has faded, the inward bodily feeling of being immersed in the moon was completely lost. Today, our experience has become restricted to that of the illumined image. So, I'm going to go a little bit deeper into Whitehead's account of perception here. I think hopefully it will be helpful. If we go back to what Steiner said at the beginning about observation, and that at bottom the only question is whether we're comprehending the observed facts correctly. And then he goes on to say that contemporary science takes perception at face value. He adds, the view of perception is so facile that contemporary science can't possibly arrive at any real comprehension of the observed data. And Steiner mentions bodily feeling as what we've lost. We're too much in our heads when we try to comprehend the heavens. And Whitehead also emphasizes bodily feeling. And he conceives of the body as the human body as subtly extended into and inseparable from its environment, sort of like the planetary spheres are not simply located. The human body also is a kind of sphere that extends into its environment. So Whitehead says, the first error of modern scientific epistemology is the assumption of a few definite avenues of communication with the external world, right? The five sense organs. This leads to the presupposition that the search for the data is to be narrowed to the question, what data are directly provided by the activity of the sense organs and preferably the eyes? He goes on to say that the living organ of experience is the living body as a whole. Every instability of any part of the body imposes an activity of readjustment throughout the whole organism. The actualities of nature must be so interpreted as to be explanatory of this fact. We cannot determine with what molecules the brain begins and the rest of the body ends. Further, we cannot tell with what molecules the body ends and the external world begins. The truth is that the brain is continuous with the body and the body is continuous with the rest of the natural world. Human experience is an act of self-origination, including the whole of nature, limited to the perspective of a focal region located within the body, but not necessarily persisting in any fixed coordination with a definite part of the brain. Elsewhere, he says, the predominant basis of perception is perception of the various bodily organs, as passing on their experiences by channels of transmission and of enhancement. It is the accepted doctrine in physical science that a living body is to be interpreted according to what is known of other sections of the physical universe. This is a sound axiom, but it is double-edged, for it carries with it the converse deduction that other sections of the universe are to be interpreted in accordance with what we know of the human body. So here, this is in my view, Whitehead's saying it's Whitehead's version of what Steiner is saying about the connection between embryology and astronomy, right? He's saying that, you know, modern science in its search for a universal causal nexus, like, you know, Newton's universal law of gravitation, which applies as much to apples falling from trees as it does to planets orbiting the sun. This search for that universal causal nexus is very important. But the problem is that Newton, in establishing that nexus, reduced human life down to its lowest common denominator, right? To gravity, to our physical mineral nature, instead of establishing that universal nexus by lifting the cosmos up to its highest potential, which is the living human being, the human organism, right? And so it's a different way of establishing this terrestrial celestial connection, right? Not just by reducing everything to gravitation, but by bringing the human being, human life back into the picture and interpreting nature in light of the fact that we are living organisms. So then Steiner talks about the three-body problem, which, you know, he's making a playful analogy to a problem in Newtonian physics and trying to understand the sort of chaos that is unleashed by the trajectories of three bodies. He makes an analogy to a sort of spiritual scientific view of these three bodies, the sun, the moon, and the earth. And he talks about how, you know, we really can't imagine the relationship between the kingdoms of nature, minerals, plants, animals, humans, in a linear way. He says we have to imagine an ideal point from which the development bifurcates, right, into one branch that is longer, arbitrarily long, he says, where the sun in its relationship to the earth brings forth plants, and that plants are driven by the terrestrialization of solar energy into this mineral form, right? And so really what this means is that the matter of the earth is an excretion of life, right? It's not that matter was here first and life came out of it. It's the opposite. And so we have this bifurcation from the ideal point that's arbitrarily long on one side. And then on the other side, there's a shorter branch that he says one might call negatively indeterminate. This negatively indeterminate branch is what leads to the human being, right? So we have vegetable and mineral kingdoms on the one side of the bifurcation and animal and human kingdoms on the other. And this term negatively indeterminate got me thinking, and my understanding of what he means there is that he's talking about a path of development that is not defined by a linear progression or qualities that can be easily quantified. So he's, by negatively indeterminate, this branch on the right side of the bifurcation, he's saying it doesn't follow a predictable positive determination towards complexity, as we might infer if we had a merely rectilinear understanding of the stream of evolution from abiogenesis, life out of matter, to more complex forms of life through biological evolution. He's breaking that linear picture down and talking about the negative indetermination that leads to the neotenous form, the youthful form of the human being relative to the animal. And the moon's relationship to the sun is playing a very important role here in the movement away from further determination into animalhood, leading to further specialization and extinction. This move away is a result of the moon mediating the light of the sun countering itself through the reflection of moonlight. And Steiner says, if we take our start from this true conception, then we're led not to a spontaneous generation of life from matter, but to this ideal center somewhere between animal and plant, a center not to be found within the physical at all, yet without doubt connected with the problem of the three bodies, the earth, the sun, the moon. Because humanity assimilates within its own nature what is mineral and animal and vegetable, there really does arise within human nature a kind of ideal point of intersection of these three influences. So here, when I think about the sun's countering of itself through moonlight, through the reflection of its light off the moon, leading to the negative indetermination of the human being, um, I, I hear Steiner describing this kind of further interiorization or and deeper incarnation of the solar logos in the human heart, right? And so he's describing a process that I think leads to the Christ, without saying so. And finally, just to wrap up here, and thanks for your indulgence. I know I'm going on a little bit longer here. What Steiner seems to be calling us toward is a shift from a modern mineralized science ruled over by the tyranny of the eyes and the rigid models of the sense-bound brain to a kind of etheric science that's freed by an open heart to perceive the true movements of the living spheres, which are not separate from the true movements of our own living bodies. We all remember Goethe saying that the healthy human being is the most precise instrument, but instead of the healthy human being, what's guiding science today is this mechanistic obsession with trying to calculate the incalculable. And so in particle colliders, the search for the secrets of nature is being undertaken, much as Newton undertook this search with his prism, as a kind of systematic fragmentation and disintegration of the living cosmos. But I think there's more there. Steiner's helping us see that there's more there to be known behind this veil of matter. And I think, hopefully my use of some of Whitehead's ideas about perception was helpful here. And I want to end with just this final line from Whitehead. That there's this deeper form of perception, these dormant organs of perception that we need to cultivate here. There's more there for knowledge, as Whitehead says. So according to the view which I am putting before you, there is nothing, where'd it go? There we go. According to the view which I am putting before you, there is nothing behind the veil of the procession of becomingness, though there is much pictured on that veil and essential to it, which our dim consciousness does not readily decipher. Indeed, the metaphor of a veil of appearance is wholly wrong. Reality is nothing else than the process of becomingness of which we are dimly conscious. Every detail of the process is open for consciousness, though in fact, our individual consciousness is only aware of a very small fragment of what is there for knowledge, right? We see the light image of the moon simply located there in the sky because our consciousness is limited to sense experience in the age of the consciousness. But there's actually more there for us to know than just that fragment. That's the invitation, at least. All right. Thanks for your attention. Let's talk about it. Leaf, I see your hand up already. Please.
Yes, sir. And thank you, Matt, for another masterful summary. Just to pick up on a comment you made about the development of future sense organs. Today is the birthday of somebody who has been called the patron saint of imagination, and that's William Blake. Was born on this day, 1757, if I have that right. I wanted to just build off of Steiner's analogy where he talks about the horse, the different freeze frames of the horse and how we piece together movement from that. And I wanted to just kind of run this by everyone and stand to be corrected if I have the wrong interpretation of what he meant to illustrate with that analogy. It's really obvious that in the case of the horse, like the perception of movement that we have is not the cause of that movement is not coming from inside of the phenomenon that we're perceiving. It was rather, I mean, obviously, well, presumably instilled by the artist from outside. And my impression of Steiner is trying to get us to begin to regard physics by analogy with, like, again, the freeze frames of the horse, and not to imagine that when we are perceiving and analyzing elements of physics, that we're determining, or that we're actually making contact with the real causal powers. There's a Plato. It's a kind of like identification of a latent genetic fallacy almost in so much, so like what characterizes the approach of so much of modern science. Plato gives a great example. I don't remember which dialogue it is, but it's something along the lines of like, why are we sitting here? Well, it's because our bones are configured in the proper angles to provide that we're sitting here. And obviously, like, well, that's not incorrect. Well, probably the best way to say it is not even wrong. And Steiner seems to be in some way pointing to, like, we have the wrong the mode of interpretation that we're trying to by which we're trying to understand nature is just not adequate to the task. And I guess I have a more also explicit question that I think is not unrelated, and that's if Steiner is also warning us not to confuse a metric that we're using with the phenomenon that it's measuring, and Matt pointed to the fact that time, I mean, time is not the same thing as the way we measure time, and my question would be then, does that go further and say something like, or does that if we grasp the principle, do we extend it to make a statement, something like the following: particles particles are not it's the same problem with particles. Like, particles are actually measurements of force, and not the real things. In other words, just the same way that the horse seems to be moving, but the real power of movement is coming from somewhere else. So in the same way, like, all of the measurements of physics have a similar kind of like deferred or power by proxy. So I'll stop there, and I hope somebody will be able to add to what I said.
Thanks, Max. If no one's ready to jump in immediately, just to clarify some of Whitehead's use of language there, where in one of the first quotes, he distinguishes between mathematical measurements and models and physical theory. When he's talking about physical there, he means like the causal power of nature. And, in Steiner's terms, that there's obviously a spiritual power at work there. And I think when Whitehead's talking about physical theory, we don't want to collapse that into mathematical model. He's searching for a physical theory that would be grounded in something that's causally real, that we can directly feel and perceive and observe. And I think it's very easy to collapse physics and the mathematical models because that's what contemporary science does. But when Whitehead makes that distinction, I think we have to make a translation into anthroposophic terms in order to understand what he means there, because I think it's still compatible with what Steiner's doing. Hey, Lorenzo, please.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I wanted to share some thoughts, and let's start with one thing. When Steiner speaks about the visible planets as being just a little part of what they actually are, because actually it's the whole of their orbit, which is filled with some substance, and so we actually are inside the moon, and the visible moon is actually just that part of the moon that is to the embryo what the fertilized part is. Well, it made me think about polarities, because the fertilized part is the part where the feminine and the masculine part come into contact, and so it's from the egg getting to the embryo. Well, that part of the embryo, which is the fertilized part, is something peculiar of the embryo. It's exactly what makes the egg an embryo, and it's also part where the two polarities somehow mixed. So this made me think about the points at infinity of projective geometry, because we have the usual Cartesian plane, and we always say, okay, to get a projective plane, we have to add this mysterious, or not so mysterious anyway, these special points at infinity. And then we also talked about the fact that actually to get the functions to be continuous, we have to imagine plus infinity and minus infinity to be actually the same point, or like a ring that closes on itself. So it's like a circle of infinite length, so it appears completely straight, but actually it's a circle, and the two opposite infinities somehow meet. So I was thinking about the planetary spheres, and I just imagined, let's say, a 3D versions of 3D version of this concept, and I thought, yeah, that's the point where the two opposites meet, because it's the fertilized part, and at the same time it's like a point inside a field, inside some kind of geometric. And so, I thought maybe, I don't know if Steiner is going there, but anyway, it's just food for thought. Maybe the visible planets are the points at infinity, or something like that. It's very speculative, but food for thought. Thank you.
Yeah. What's interesting to me here is just the since the time that Steiner has died, obviously, I mean, some people do doubt that we've gone to the moon, but we've at least gone into orbit, and we've seemingly have sent probes to Mars and whatnot. So there is a physical body out there, apparently. But that physical body is still, though we've in a way touched it with our extensions, our technological extensions, that's just a fragmentary image of this larger spherical process that we are inside of, all of these spheres. And so, the geometry here is quite bizarre, that to our physical senses, there very much does appear to be physical bodies out there. But to higher organs of perception, there's more to those fragments than meets the eye. Karsten?
Yeah, I was just inspired to think about how this affects how we view ourselves, because what Steiner is kind of saying here is that we can see ourselves as a space for the moon and the heavenly bodies. So I recall Eckhart Tolle. He has a practical advice he very often gives to people who are in difficult circumstances. You should ask yourself, can I be the space for this? So I think it's interesting that these are not only different views of the world, but it's also different views of ourselves, that we can see ourselves as this point-like physical existence, somehow impenetrable, or how to say it, impenetrable by the influences from outer space. But what Steiner's hinting at is that we are infused in our own being with the influences of all these heavenly bodies. So So it kind of hints at another way of looking at ourselves also as a space in which the heavens are moving, so to speak. So just a little thought I got.
Yeah, it's a lovely inversion to keep in mind. I mean, that's like what Goethe is saying about the human being, the healthy human being, as our most accurate instrument for observing the universe, right? To see how we become the mirror of that cosmic whole.
If nobody else wants to chime in, maybe I want to add something like, so also there's kind of, I mean, I don't know very much about Steiner's esoteric teachings, but I get this feeling that he's kind of, when he's looking at the plants and the animal and the human being, it's like we have different roles to play in the, say, in the ecology of the whole earth. So it seems like the plant is kind of grounding solar energy, making it kind of transforming solar energy into physical stuff that animals and human beings can use for their own purposes as an energy resource, so to speak. And also there's this U-turn in a sense that, I mean, the plant is kind of, it's vertical and its reproductive organs are oriented towards the sun. And then Steiner, in some of the previous lectures, he's talking about how the animal, there's kind of a horizontal axis, and then the human being is erect, but in the opposite direction, so to speak, of the plant. So we have our reproductive organs oriented towards the earth. And then we have another center, the head, oriented towards the cosmos. So it also seems like just like the plant is taking in solar energy, transforming it to physical stuff, we have somehow a role taking in some kind of, I don't know, cosmic energy and transforming that into maybe, I don't know, culture, neighborly love, whatever. So I just think that's kind of, I'm not sure where he's going. So I just think it's interesting to kind of think about this transform gradually from plant life through animal life to human life, and this change of orientation. So we're, in a sense, we're going in the opposite direction of the plants.
Yeah, as Plato said in the Timaeus, the human being is an inverted plant. And I hadn't thought about this inversion also in terms of the reproductive organs of the plants, facing towards the sun. And I guess with the way that the moon causes this negative indetermination and this U-turn of the human from the animal, it's as if maybe with the moon's relationship to human reproduction, that our reproductive organs are oriented towards the moon in some way. There's so much in this new image of the relationship between the various kingdoms of nature that remains to be unpacked. For me, I find it such a generative diagram. Hey, Chad.
Good morning, everyone. Just to piggyback on what you just said, there's clearly a strong relationship between women's fertility cycle and the moon as far as our reproductive organs go. And I think we touched on how the solar influence, as you were saying, is Karsten intimating that has more of a vertical connection. I think with the path that the sun travels in our relationship to it, our perception, right, the up and down kind of process through the year, I think he connected that to the physical growth. Is that correct? Back in the early stages. So it does seem like the sun has more of that vertical orientation and the lunar is more relational. I mean, archetypally, that's also true. And I have to confess, I didn't actually listen to this week's lecture, but thank you so much for your introduction there, Matt, because I'm really inspired by it. I'm definitely going to go back and listen to it. I actually did listen to it a couple times, but I listened to it because I was not sleeping well traveling this week, and the sound of his voice I find really calms me and puts me to sleep. So I listened to it a couple times, but not integrating. So I'm gonna listen to it afterwards today and go back and watch your presentation again because it's really rich. But what it made me think about was how it really resonates, that idea that we're inside the moon or we're inside the planetary spheres. I remember you mentioning, and I saw at the Science of Consciousness conference in 2017, a lecture on the sun as, it doesn't end at the at the surface of the sun. It extends all the way out to the edge of the solar system, in a sense where everything's inside of the sun in that sense. And I had this wonderful experience with my family where my nephew is just turned 12 in August, and Jupiter is a 12-year orbit, a 12-year cycle for it to go around the zodiac once and return to where it was when we were born. And so he's going through his Jupiter return, and Jupiter archetypally is about growth and expansion. And he happened to have his voice just deepen in the last week before I got there, but his Jupiter return was exact at the time. And it's just an interesting correlation to growth, expansion, puberty. It's a 12-year cycle. It connects to that in a sense. And I think it's absolutely true. I think that is what's happening. We're inside of all these planetary spheres. We're not separate from any of them. And I do actually think we can recognize them as a form of the logos. They are words, they're symbols, they have deep symbolic meaning. And it's speaking a language. It is a language, an archetypal language that we can commune with and also recognize them as spiritual beings. I mean, Jupiter doesn't just correlate to puberty and growth. It's a deep philosophical principle that ultimately has a Zeus-like character in its personified form. In many ways, it connects to hubris and magnanimity and generosity of spirit. It's very extremely rich, like all the archetypes. But something else I wanted to mention or just bring up for you guys, for reflection, is this idea of the relativity of time and our relationality to multiple spheres of influence. And it made me think about how, like, there's a certain determined aspect to time in the movements of the planets, in that like a solar eclipse, for example. There's going to be a solar eclipse on April 8th. I don't remember the time right now, but that time is set. That time is not arbitrary. It's not relative in that sense. It will occur at a certain time, and it will last for 4.5 minutes, and it will end at a certain time. That has a determined quality to it. Yes, we're in a relational process with them, but I'm just curious what you guys think. It made me think about it, I think, more clearly for the first time than I have, because I'm very influenced by Einstein and quantum theory and relativity and the nature of that dynamic, or that understanding, conception of time. But there is a certain way in which there's a more static or more determined dimension that is inescapable. Like, we can't change those events when they'll happen. We also can't change the timing of our transits, meaning like where the planets move in relationship to where they were when we were born. That relationship is set at the moment of any birth, where the planets will return back to where that birth of that event or that person came into being. So the process relational dimension, and thanks for bringing in Whitehead. I thought it was clearly resonant with everything you were bringing up, with Steiner's perspective as well. But yeah, I don't know. What do you guys think about that kind of arbitrary or ambiguous kind of, not arbitrary, ambiguous in the sense of like our relational, sense of a relative sense of time. And then there's something else, it seems, that's also true, possibly, which the universe is paradoxical. So maybe shouldn't be surprised. But anyway, just my thoughts. Like Lorenzo, speculative.
Yeah, really interesting point, Chad, about how calculable astronomical events are in some sense. That we know exactly when and where that eclipse will be visible. But I think I can connect this to what Angus was saying about in a different lecture cycle. Steiner refers to planets and stars as the corpses of spiritual beings. They are present everywhere. The real sphere is present everywhere other than in the planetary body or star itself. And so, when Steiner's talking about the visible part of the planetary spheres, that the illumined body that appears to our eyes is a visible sign. There's an invisible sphere behind that sign, and so I think the issue of feeling like we're determined by these planetary bodies and their geometrical positions, I think, is to mistake the sign for the meaning in a way. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wasn't trying to imply.
No, I wasn't saying you were saying
Yeah,
that, but
yeah,
to
yeah,
escape
yeah.
the dilemma you were setting up, it seems like, yeah.
Yeah, totally.
Lorenzo.
Yeah, I'd like to add another thought. This is on the same line of reasoning of the one before, but maybe even more speculative. I was looking at this very peculiar chart of animal and plant and its prosecution and the mineral and its retroversion in the human. And I have been struck by one coincidence. Is do you know how to calculate the cross ratio? That's the cross ratio is that value that is invariant in projective geometry, and it's the ratio between lengths of segments that are on the same line, on the same rectangle, on the same straight line. And this is the only value that stays the same in projective geometry, meaning that if you look something like this, and then you look at something like this, you get this foreshortening. What stays the same in the foreshortening is the ratio between these lengths. And to calculate it, one has to divide a straight line in segments, and one puts them this length in a formula, which is peculiar because it has, if I remember correctly, has one part which is negative. That is, you have to use the segment going, let's say, from D back to C, or let's say from B back to A. So you have the direction of the segments is actually used in the formula. I don't really know why. I mean, I haven't dealt with enough depth on the reasons why the formula for calculating the cross section is that. But I know this thing that there are segments of the straight line that you put in relationship one to the other in a direct way, and so you get positive numbers, and the other part you get one side where one of the four segments is retroverted, and so you get a negative number. I don't think it's the only way of calculating cross ratios, but I know it's the way that's usually explained when one is dealing with a geometrical exposition, a geometrical proof. Maybe it's not just like more intuitive. It's probably historically the way that's been done the first time, because it's more closer to our intuition. Then there are probably other ways to calculate that. And so I was struck by this idea of these four parts, of which one is the last one is with a, let's say, a minus sign. And I don't know if any of you has thought about cross ratio and why the formula looks like that. It also reminds me a little of do you know Giambattista Vico, Italian philosopher, the new science? He had this idea of a circular history, and there are cycles that repeat, a little like Eastern philosophy, let's say. But anyway, there are always three epochs in his cycles. Let's say more barbaric and seminal era, then let's say equilibrium, golden era, and then decadence, to put it very simply. And then you have this fourth part, which is the more peculiar to Vico's thought, is the ricorso. This ricorso that has fastened many thinkers, like, for example, Joyce was fascinated by this idea and wrote Finnegan's Wake, also using this idea. So there is this fourth phase, which brings everything back to the beginning. It's like a rewind phase. So Vico had this idea of birth, golden age, decadence, and then you don't go back right to the start, but you have to rewind things, and you have this ricorso. And once again, this is the same shape we are looking at here, sort of. So some more food for thought.
Thanks, Lorenzo. I'm gonna have to read more about cross ratios. Karsten, please.
Yeah, just a little thing following up upon what Chad was talking about, and also this image that we're discussing. So I just came to think about Steiner's expression in Philosophy of Freedom, where he says something like, nature makes man a natural being, society makes him a law-abiding being, but only man himself can make himself a free being. So I see also in this, I mean, the plant, like some being that is purely determined by natural forces, and all that is kind of fixed beforehand. There's not any room for freedom there. And then you have the animal, where you have the birth of the relational capacities, the flock, the herd mentality, and so on. And you have some kind of society going on between animals. And then you have man turning around and erecting himself again, but this time freely from within, so to speak, and also connecting to perhaps cosmic forces. I think there's something about a center in the head that is kind of some kind of reproductive organ as well, but it has to do with imagination. So it's a new kind of sexuality, you could say, giving birth to ideas, to cultures, to artwork, and so on. But it has to do more with cosmic forces that set us free, in opposition to these, say, solar forces that kind of determine our fate more, in a more rigid fashion. Yeah, just a little more food for thought.
Yeah, that's lovely. I mean, I think of, the story of Genesis, the human being created on the sixth day and left in an unfinished state. And that's like this neotenous nature of the human being, that we're unfinished because we're free. And if we're going to complete that U-turn and that arc, it's not going to happen because the cosmos wills it. It's only going to happen if we will it. And we're kind of, maybe we've been given a boost and like lobbed in that direction by the cosmos, but we're going to fall back down if we don't learn to continue the trajectory ourselves.
Yeah, so it's like the cosmic forces are not determining us, but we can attract the cosmic forces and utilize them if we're open towards it, if we will it.
Any final thoughts that those who haven't spoken yet have been incubating?
I can just add one thing that came to mind before when Lorenzo was talking about the infinity point. With I wasn't quite clear. I was still waking up, but it made me think about the example I gave with the eclipses, because it does kind of, I see them. It's like it creates a shadow. It's a line. It points directly to the Earth. It has like a point to it. I think you were kind of saying that, Lorenzo. No, like collapsing the alignments into a plane or something. Sorry, I wasn't quite clear, but it made me think of that.
Well, yeah, in some sense, yes, because it's as you said, a collapsing of functions on the same point. So yeah, you mean the opposition between sun, or sorry, the conjunction between sun and moon and the eclipse is that kind of event. Yeah, I was imagining, that the sphere of the moon, let's say, was actually not originally spherical, but to be thought of as some sort of straight line, or maybe a cylinder that had one, let's say, positive and one negative end. And then that through our representation, that is curved on itself until it gets the spherical shape, or almost spherical, the ellipsoidal shape or whatever. And that those 2 points, which were on a certain level, let's say, opposite, then they are superimposed on that limb, that section of the sphere. There is a point, a little like the omphalos, how do you call this? The
navel.
The navel. Yeah. But as I said, also the point in cytoplasm where it's always the same. But imagine, yes, something that curves on itself and touches itself, and this special point of superposition might be the actual visible planet. But as Angus was saying in the chat, actually, we should look at the visible planets as the dead part, the dead stuff. So maybe there is something about what I said that is relevant, but I don't know how much. It was very speculative, and maybe it's just, a wrong idea.
It was, but it was interesting to me as far as the infinity dimension, and thinking of like, there's seems a very internal nature to the cyclical periods of the planets, but we know, or we assume from science that it's not eternal, but it does seem to kind of point towards points and lines within longer spherical or period planes. And I don't know, I get a real timeless sense from eclipses in particular, that it's kind of a portal, an opening into the eternal. But maybe that's just, again, really speculative as well. But yeah, it's the kind of nodes lining up in eternity, these eternal points, planes along. Yeah. Anyway, speculative.
Yeah. Well, I've got to wrap up here, but eclipses as like openings into that allow like death forces, I think ultimately, and not death isn't, we can't just treat it as something evil. It's like it's the path to initiation beyond which, if we want to perceive with our spiritual organs of perception, the threshold we need to cross is death, like the death of the physical body. And so, bringing in that sort of Christic image, which is totally implicit in Steiner's lecture, but nonetheless quite strikingly implied in what he's saying, I think is part of what we're being invited into. And the eclipse, as the dead part of the planetary spheres aligns the sun and the moon, really does present us this opportunity to confront that guardian of the threshold, into the spiritual world.
Beautiful. I think it add just our consciousness and unconscious, or solar consciousness and the unconscious, the shadow dimension of who we are, the unconscious dimension of being, and that play between consciousness and the unconscious, or life and death, and the portal between the unknown and the known.
Because like the eclipse would be the opposite of the full moon situation, which is what Steiner is saying creates that reflective opportunity for the human curve back from animal specialization to occur. So when the eclipse is happening, it's like the inverse of that. A lot to think through in terms of the symbolism of that. But anyways, we should wrap up. Lecture 15 next week. Looking forward to it. See you all there. Bye.
See you.
Be well, everyone.